Hello, everyone. This is Eva Smith with YogaUOnline, and I am super excited to be here today with Doug Keller, yoga teacher, yoga therapist, author, and probably one, I would say, of the most well-read and widely educated teachers that we have in the yoga community today. And Doug, I'm going to refrain from making the joke about both of your parents being scientists, but oh, oops, there I did it.
There it is, yeah.
But welcome, Doug. We're so pleased to have you join us.
Thank you very much.
Today.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
So I thought to start out, we kind of think we may be heading our way out of the pandemic. At least we're a lot more relaxed. It seems the numbers are down. There's not such grave consequences necessarily of getting infection. And so we're kind of breathing a sign of relief or a sigh of relief. So I wonder where, in your experience, as yoga emerges from these 2 years of kind of going into our closets and doing our own thing, how have we changed? Where do you see things going? How may the pandemic affect how we frame yoga going forward?
I do see people with an increased comfort level with coming back to class because each week a few more people showing up and they're less nervous about being there with other people. And most of them have been practicing on home with Zoom classes. And there is this element of appreciating the rediscovery of the communal element of class. And it's funny because for so long, yoga in the West was being criticized as being too much of a group experience and kind of losing the individual aspect of the practice. And the last couple of years of pandemic, people have been, with the guidance of a teacher on their screen, coming back to a very intensely personal inward practice that they're doing in their own living room. And I think getting in touch with elements of the practice that perhaps they weren't in touch with when they were in classes with groups of people. They were paying more attention to what they were feeling in the practice, what they felt they could do. And if they didn't feel they wanted to go as far in a pose as the class was going, then they had the choice of doing the pose that really suited them and really fitting into the comfort of the practice. And at the same time, there's the sense that something was missing as far as having the support of the group atmosphere. And so now we're kind of emerging from that very individual practice, coming back to rediscovering the communal support that comes with it. And it'll be interesting to see people's orientation to that. I find students in class perhaps appreciate having each other there more than they did in the past. There used to be, a little bit of vying for your favorite place in class, or a little bit of grumbling about being crowded by other people. My classes were never jam-packed like you see in some of the, classes where mats were 6 inches apart. It was never like that in my classes, but still people were a little bit more possessive about their space and not necessarily quite as open to others. And that's shifting. They're careful about proximity, but at the same time appreciating the proximity, if that makes any sense, kind of a contradiction in that sense. I think one of the places where yoga is going to go is going to be really important is coming out of COVID. There are the consequences of long COVID, or how people have been affected by the virus, even if they had a mild case of COVID, because for them, exercise is not and cannot be what it was before. People suffering from these symptoms, if they try to push themselves to get back to exercise, they actually get worse for making that effort instead of better. And so there's going to be some kind of adjustment in how yoga is approached, especially for people looking to recover their body and recover their health after going through the virus, but doing it in a way that's actually productive for them. So this is almost a whole new dimension of the therapeutic aspect of yoga, where the person is not coming to class quite so much with an injury or that sort of thing, but rather looking to reconnect with their own nervous system and their own body, in a way in which they start to generate more energy for themselves. And so it can't be a fitness and stretching class for these people in the way that perhaps they enjoyed in the past. There's a whole new relationship to the practice. And I think that's something that can be instructive for all of us, even if we don't suffer from long-term symptoms from COVID. It's a time to contemplate reconnection with our own self and our own body outside of just concern about the fitness aspect of the practice or the stretching aspect or even the kind of goal-oriented approach that people perhaps even subconsciously brought to the practice in the past. That's not serving us now, or it's not serving many people now. And so it's going to be a kind of reframing and a rediscovery, I think, in a lot of ways. And teachers have to be more open and perceptive to what the needs of the student are in the moment. In the past, students often look to the teachers to push them a little bit, to take them further, to motivate them. And now pushing, a lot of people are going to experience as being severely counterproductive. And so the relationship with the teacher, I think, is going to change too. You're not there to have a drill sergeant or somebody push you. You're having somebody to walk the journey with you, if you will. So it's going to be an interesting challenge for the teachers, as well as a rethinking for the students. And we'll just have to see how that plays out.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think it's almost like we're emerging into the third age of yoga.
Yeah.
As we know it in the West, the first age being the yoga of the guru, right? All these teachers that came to India and who, by virtue of having practiced yoga for a gazillion years, were very specialized, very skilled, and they came with a lot of great things and with a lot of not so great things. And then we emerged into the second age of yoga, which I like to quote Donna Farhi. She coined the term, the tyranny of the image. And I think the second age of yoga very much has been characterized by the tyranny of the image. The Instagram yoga, the super yoga stars, the Lululemon $150 yoga pants, where yes, yoga became popular, but what was it? Was it like looking good in yoga postures and in yoga pants and having a yoga body? You know, it was kind of getting a little bit away from what we might call the roots of yoga. And I love what you said about it, the pandemic sort of forcing us more to turn inward and practice a form of yoga that really helps us own yoga again in our own body.
Yeah, I find Mark Singleton's book, Yoga Body, had a fascinating chapter in it, talking about how the advent of photography transformed the practice, not just the practice of yoga, but also in many, many different fields. With photography, people were starting to see themselves for the first time. And then there was that body image consciousness that became part of yoga, but not just yoga. You also had the advent of fitness in general and so many other permutations. And so this far preceded Instagram, and Instagram, you know, the Instagram yogi is just kind of the nth degree of the same phenomenon. But I think a lot of the concern about alignment also came with the advent of photography, where people could actually observe their alignment. And there was a sense that the beauty of the form of the pose was part of the very requirement or nature of the pose. I remember, because Mr. Iyengar, when he first did his Light on Yoga, the book was actually much bigger than the one that was published, because he did a lot of photographs and a lot more poses. And so they kind of edited it down to the one that we're familiar with. But if you look at the book, you see many of the pictures, he actually went and redid the pose and reshot the picture when he was in his late 50s and 60s. And he was actually doing the pose better then than he was back in his 40s. His chaturanga was different. The other poses were different. And that was partly a result of the fact that he could see the pictures of himself and how he was doing them. There was a quote that I remember from him, and I've tried to search down the source and I haven't been successful. So maybe my mind created this quote, but I'm not quite sure it's inaccurate. But I remember him as saying, when I look at the old pictures of me, I understand where some of my injuries came from. In other words, he looked at the pictures of himself doing the practice and realized what he was doing in the practice that was actually not serving him well. And with his own understanding, he corrected that over time. So photography has had a huge influence on the practice, and this self-image that comes from seeing ourselves from the outside has shaped the practice in good ways as well as bad ways, because there's image consciousness and we want to do something that looks astounding and beautiful, and that can be counterproductive in the sense of doing more and more exotic forms of poses that look more like you've been in a car accident than in a yoga class, you know, with your leg behind your head one way and your arm going the other way. But on the other hand, it's also helped us to improve the practice. And so, like you're saying, there's that stage of seeing ourselves for a period of really what's about 100 years now, or short of 100 years. And now we're entering a new phase where how we see our health, how we see ourselves and our yoga posture is not just about the beauty of the outer form, especially as more and more diverse people are practicing yoga, which is a terrific thing. And we're bringing more and more diverse bodies to it, and letting go of the idea that everybody has to look like a particular body in order to be successful at yoga. We're starting to understand the inner blossoming, the inner benefit is the real goal once again. So we're kind of returning back to our roots, or the roots of yoga, after having made a long journey during which a lot was gained and brought back once again. And so I think there's even a deeper perception into the practice than perhaps many of those early yogis had, particularly as they were focused more on their inner spiritual evolution with the emphasis upon the Kundalini, and a bit less concern about all of the permutations for the physical body, as well as how we function in life, along with seeking spiritual evolution. So we've picked up a lot along the way, and so it's a good and interesting time to come back to it and reconfigure our whole relationship to yoga. So yeah.
If we talk about this third age of yoga, I think the hope has always been that we would find a way to use a common phrase, make yoga more accessible to everybody, to get yoga to a point where the health benefits of yoga is something that becomes a normal part of the fitness repertoire that people can access. And of course, that has been a hope and a goal of the yoga community. I don't know if we're any closer to achieving that, but in your work teaching, as you do in many different parts of the world, what do you see happening in this space?
I do see that a dimension that's becoming more part of the yoga is a greater appreciation of our relationship to our nervous system, particularly as we've been under and continue to be under so many different kinds of stress upon the nervous system and all the challenges that we face. And wherever over the last couple of years, I've been speaking all over the world, but not in physical presence, but by Zoom projection. But there is, a concern about pain problems that come up in the body, that come up with stress and work and that sort of thing. But it's more about finding a more supportive and constructive relationship with your own nervous system and understanding how that works. And of course, that's always been a part of yoga, and not necessarily a goal of the fitness system, because the fitness system has been more about accomplishment and about becoming more and more efficient in developing your body, and according to a concept of what fitness constitutes. And certainly there's references to the nervous system, but with yoga, there's always been an understanding it's our relationship to the stresses of life, where stress can lead to suffering. We all experience some degree of pain in our life, physical pain, emotional pain, and when pain continues for a period of time, particularly without understanding fully the causes and with the sort of fear and uncertainty and even depression that comes with it, that's when pain becomes suffering. And in that sense, yoga has always been concerned about the problem of suffering. And I think as we understand our relationship with the nervous system more deeply, we come to a better understanding of how to deal with suffering, which is prolonged pain. I think there were tools in yoga from the start that dealt with that. In the fall, I'll be talking about the whole problem of dysautonomia, or disruption of the autonomic nervous system, which is one of the manifestations of long COVID, and was also present before COVID, before the advent of COVID, in problems like fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, and many of the other mysterious disorders that the medical profession couldn't quite put their finger on as to the cause. There's a common set of symptoms that indicate the autonomic nervous system is not functioning as it should. And so we're less able to shift from an excited sympathetic state, which in yoga is often described in terms of rajas, back to a more calm parasympathetic or sattvic state. Our adaptability in life depends upon how we can meet the challenges of life, which involves sympathetic activation or stimulation, but at the same time, be adaptable enough to return back to a parasympathetic state. And somebody with dysautonomia is experiencing fatigue, brain fog, and all of these other symptoms because that mechanism for shifting back to parasympathetic has been disrupted, and they're stuck in a sort of rajasic cycle. And as I studied this, what became fascinating to me was to go back to the ideas of the vayus and the gunas in yoga, and recognizing, particularly with the vayus, we could often think in one sense of pranavayu as being stimulation and apanavayu as being calming or grounding. This is one way to conceive it. It's been conceived of in a number of ways, even in the yoga tradition. So there's that movement between raja stimulation and sattva calmness, or stimulation as prana, calmness as apana. So those are the two vayus, prana and apana. The next vayu is samana vayu, which is concerned with digestion traditionally. And it's the sort of in-between vayu between prana and apana. And what's fascinating in studying dysautonomia is how the communication between the nervous system and the body takes place through the production of hormones. That's kind of the messenger and the mediator that tells the body how to function based upon the hormones produced, stimulated by the nervous system. And most of that takes place through the gut, through the digestive system, or everything connected with it. And so samana vayu is actually the communicator and the mediator between sympathetic and parasympathetic. And of course, yoga was traditionally concerned with the health of the digestive system as being a support for doing practice. But it wasn't fully explained how that works, except that if your stomach's upset, it's really hard to meditate. So you want a clear digestive system. But in treating dysautonomia, particularly with long COVID and then the things preceding that, the first thing the doctors look at are the absence of certain hormones in the body that indicate some dysfunction in the nervous system, where that hormone is not being produced in a way that maintains balance in the body. So they look to either substitute for that hormone or stimulate its production. A lot of the stimulation is taking place through study of the vagus nerve, because there's an understanding of how dysfunction in the vagus nerve is linked very much to that lack of hormonal production. I'm simplifying a lot here. It's a complicated process for the doctors. But I think the aspects of yoga that look at the breath, the vagus nerve is our kind of yoga nerve connected to the breath, but also connected to the gut, as well as connected to our emotional life and how the autonomic nervous system mediates all of that. That's a whole deep aspect of yoga and yoga practice that, you know, might get integrated into the fitness industry as well. I mean, they're good at absorbing ideas and bringing them into what they're presenting. But this concern, which is something we can explore more and more deeply with yoga through the practices of pranayama and through approaches to asana, is supporting this balanced state of the autonomic nervous system, particularly when it's attacked by viruses such as COVID or other causes for other conditions, again, like fibromyalgia that we don't fully understand yet. And of course, there's a lot more to COVID than simply dysautonomia, but that's one of the main dysfunctions that takes place as within long COVID. So I think that's something to be really addressed and pursued and understood.
I think, you know, this dysautonomia, the dysfunction of the nervous system, I mean, we hear about it in relation to long COVID, but I think, you know, for decades, we've heard about stress, the effects of stress, the importance of stress management. And that's really part of the same picture, that stress
Yeah.
is a dysregulation of the nervous system where we get pushed beyond our ability to kind of come back into balance. And you mentioned, you know, part of that constellation, a big part is the vagus nerve, the gut. Another part of the body we often hear about in that context is the psoas muscle. And you have a course coming up with us on the psoas muscle. And could you talk about how the psoas fits into that? You know, that's a muscle. So with the vagus nerve, you can kind of see why it would regulate the nervous system, but a muscle?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's intimately intertwined with the breath and the movement of the diaphragm and diaphragmatic breathing. So it's not just a muscle that moves bones. It's actually not, apart from providing stability to the spine, it's not that strong a muscle as far as movement or action. And so it's not a muscle like a bicep or a tricep or a hamstring. And the first misconception we have about the psoas is we need to go in and release or stretch the psoas just like we stretch our hamstrings or other things like that. Our relationship to the psoas is different, intimately tied to the breath. And it's also, I always call it the second most emotional muscle in the body, the heart being the first most emotional, because our heartbeat changes from moment to moment according to our feeling and emotion. But the psoas responds to our emotional states too. Particularly, it's related to a shock response. And so when there's a loud noise and people suddenly crouch because they hear the noise, that's a contraction of the psoas at the core. And it's a stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system with that crouching. And it's easy to go into that state. It's kind of hard to release and come back out of that once again. And so the psoas is more a muscle that you're inviting to let go rather than trying to go in there and stretch and force it to release. It doesn't respond very well to force, in other words, and working too hard on the psoas or working too aggressively can be counterproductive, where you get kind of blowback from that attempt. And in relationship to that, I just wanted to give one example of about hormones related to it, because the psoas is so close to the gut and the functioning of the gut and the circulation of the gut. We think, for instance, of cortisol as being the stress hormone. And we hear about how people put on stress weight, experience fatigue, and experience other bad effects because of cortisol, when actually it's a beneficial hormone that is produced in order for us to respond to the immediacy of a situation, but we're meant to come out of that state quickly. And then, you know, that hormone is replaced by the functioning of the other hormones. Cortisol becomes a bad thing when we stay stuck in that stress state, and cortisol continues to be produced. That's when it has its bad effects upon the body. And the psoas does have an influence upon the functioning of the gut, of the whole digestive system, and all of the things that are produced within the body to support that whole process. And so it's very much, if you will, being in touch with your gut feelings as you do the practice, linking that to the breath and creating a kind of release inside. And the psoas muscle is a muscle that's so deep you don't really feel it. you feel its effects. If it's tight, if it's jammed, you feel its effects upon the back. You have back pain or perhaps hip pain, but you don't really directly feel the tightness of the psoas itself. And so we're more in touch with our inner feeling, a sense of interoception. When the psoas is released, to me, you both, and I'll describe how this works, you both feel fully grounded in the body, but at the same time, light and tall and upright. It's like a tree that the deeper it sends down its roots, the higher it grows and the more steady it is in its growth through the trunk and blossoming through the branches. So a released psoas has this quality in your own body of being grounded and flourishing, opening, growing at the same time. What I want to talk about in the course is not just about the psoas. We'll certainly look at psoas releases, this idea of psoas release. This is a topic that, of course, a lot of teachers have covered in a lot of different ways, and it's worth exploring all of the different ways. We'll look at some of the ones that seem to me to be effective as both passive and active releases. But I also want to look at the other systems of muscles in the body that can be considered as substitutes for the psoas, or they play a supportive role for the psoas. And often when people do psoas stretches or poses that they think of as being a psoas stretch, what they're really feeling as a stretch are these substitutes or these sort of supporters of the psoas. For instance, the iliacus is part of the iliopsoas, but it's distinct from psoas major in what it does. And the iliacus is connected to the quadratus lumborum. And some of the stretches that are considered psoas stretches are actually stretching iliacus and its connection to the quadratus lumborum first. And that has to be released before you even get to the psoas itself and get it to release. Another one is the pectineus, the short adductors of the inner thighs. So I want to look at yoga poses that effectively address the substitutes for the psoas as being the first layer of the body that you have to get through to even get to the psoas. And these substitutes are more tangibly stretched. You feel that stretch more when you're doing particularly the classic poses, from standing poses to other back bends and forward bends. We want to understand how they work and what's the kind of alignment that we can practice in a pose that effectively targets these sets of substitutes. And then with that, we can penetrate deeper with the breath, with more deeper inner releases to the layer of the psoas. And so we get that sort of inner blossoming or inner release that's an inner sign of having contact at that level. But there are layers and layers we need to go through, and we need to understand those layers. Otherwise, we misconceive poses as being psoas stretches when they haven't really gotten to the psoas yet. And it's only by getting through those layers that you can even get to that effectively, particularly in yoga poses.
Yeah, that's super interesting because most stretches are very soothing and comforting. For example, hamstring stretches in a forward bend, as long as you don't strain. But when it comes to working with the traditional psoas stretches, it's usually not a soothing experience. So that is what you're talking about, right?
There are two extremes. I mean, there's the super subtle psoas releases, and Liz Cook, who wrote the psoas book, and then another one after that. And I was able to train with her in a workshop way back in California. She's like the psoas lady, and her work with the psoas has to do with subtle movement. And it's very, very subtle work. And it's kind of hard to translate that as a yoga teacher into a class because it's so subtle that students really have to have the patience to take the time with it. And they're not quite sure what they're feeling. So it's not always that productive to do in a yoga class unless you find an accessible form of that produces a little bit of a tangible result without dwelling on it too long. And then you can take that into the class. So in other words, there's one end of the spectrum, which is the very subtle, deep work with the psoas that takes time and patience and relaxation. And it's going into the softer poses that are not necessarily the active poses that people are looking for when they come to class. The other end of the spectrum are the more aggressive poses, trying to get a deep stretch to the psoas, usually involving like a deeper form of a back bend and a deeper form of a hip stretch. And in those poses, you're more likely to stretch the tendon of the psoas that runs across the hip, which can have negative effects as far as destabilizing the hip before you actually get to the psoas itself. I mean, you can get a deep stretch on the hamstring because it's accessible. You can, do Supta Padangusthasana or Hanumanasana and get into a deep lengthening of the hamstring. You can't, first of all, the psoas is not hard like a hamstring. Second of all, most human beings can't bend their spine deep enough to get the same kind of stretch to the psoas as you might feel in a hamstring doing a hamstring stretch. And so you can't even expect to approach it in that way. And some poses, the more extreme poses, seek that, but of course that's not accessible to most people, and again can be counterproductive in the process of trying it.
Yeah, great, wonderful. Well, Doug, it sounds like an awesome course on a topic with so many wide-ranging consequences in terms of not just the health of our posture and our musculoskeletal system, but as you pointed out, really our connection to the nervous system and our ability to regulate stress and diminish the consequences of these life events that seem to always be rolling around just when we are not expecting a curveball, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's that moment of arriving in the pose, and in the past, people would think about the peak pose like you do progressively challenging poses until you can do the peak pose or the apex or the ultimate form that you're going for, whether it's a deep back bend or that sort of thing. And you're in that peak for a moment. And this is a very different attitude. It's not working towards a more extreme version of an asana. It's rather looking for the moment where you finally arrive in the pose. Like, okay, now I'm finally here in my body and I can be here. It's a being at home in your body. And so it's relaxing, not in the sense that it's a relaxation pose that you go to sleep in. And it's not stimulating in the sense that you're pushing and pushing until you finally achieve that apex of what you think the pose is supposed to be. Somewhere in between is just being in the pose and feeling the opening that comes there. That's the place of coming into what we're calling the psoas, or really the whole core of the body, because there's so much of the body that we often call the core, including but not limited to the abdominals that are the container for the core, with the psoas at the center. And so we want to look in the workshop, the webinar, at how we can have an expanded concept of the core, and how we can make that experience of the core more supportive to this sort of inner blossoming or this inner release, where you can actually come home to being at that place in the asana. Of course, the basic meaning of asana is seat. And so really one thing we're looking for in asana practice is finally to take our seat in the pose. Even if it's challenging standing pose or something like that, there's that sense of coming home to that place at the center. This is the quality of asana, which is different from a posture. We translate it as posture, but posture is how we hold ourselves and how we present ourselves to the world. That's not necessarily being seated at home within ourselves, within our own heart, if you will.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting. It's easier and more accessible to get to that place in very simple poses that engage the deep core and the psoas, rather than the big flashy standing posture. So it's a little bit of a shift in terms of what is real yoga. Well, actually lying on your back and engaging the psoas muscle and the deep core is maybe more real than big fancy Ikapada Kapotanasana.
Yeah, I mean, to get back to your point, you can't take a picture of a released psoas. you can be in a pose with a relaxed released psoas, but a picture is not going to show that. Whereas, we take a picture of the drama of the pose, but we don't take a picture of the real essence of it.
Yeah, that's a beautiful point. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Doug. Really
you.
appreciate it. And we're super excited about your course. Can't wait to connect with you for that one. It's always memorable when we have a course with you because you bring so many new insights and perspectives to
Thank
your
you.
topics. So we really appreciate you
I
joining us.
look forward to joining you all. I look forward to it.
Thank you so much. And everyone listening in, take care. And we will see you at your next course at YogaU.
Great.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay.